Every day they come, 500,000 people, from 1,500 square miles around Chicago. They converge on an area just 7 blocks long and 5 blocks wide, Chicago's downtown loop. How do we fit so many people into such a small space? Well, we've built a city in the sky. Chicago is world famous for its tall buildings. In fact, the skyscraper was born here. This is the Sears Tower, the tallest peak in what is really a man-made mountain range. And I'm about to take you on a hike in those mountains. I'm Jeffrey Baer. I'm a producer at WTTW Channel 11, and I'm also a volunteer tour guide for the Chicago Architecture Foundation. The sky's the limit in Chicago, and you can see the whole history of the high-rise in just a few square blocks. On this walking tour, you'll see some of the first skyscrapers ever built. And you'll also see neoclassical style buildings that surpassed them in popularity at the turn of the century. I'll show you streamlined Art Deco buildings from the 1920s and 30s, modernism from the 50s and 60s, and decorative 1980s postmodern buildings too. You'll see masterpieces by history-making architects like Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, Mies van der Rohe, and Helmut Jahn. The history of the high-rise is really a history of dreamers and fortune seekers, people with something to prove. Skyscrapers, after all, are more than a way to maximize land use. They're symbols. They symbolize the soaring ambition of the people who built them. And the most ambitious statement anyone's made yet in Chicago is this building, the Sears Tower. It was designed by architect Bruce Graham and engineer Fazlur Khan of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and it was completed in 1974. It rises more than a quarter mile into the sky, 1,450 feet to be precise. For 23 years, it was the tallest building on the planet. Every year, 1.5 million people take an ear-popping ride on the high-speed elevator up here to the sky deck on the 103rd floor. They come for this spectacular view, even if this isn't the tallest building in the world anymore. The Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat gave the title to the newly built Petronas Towers in Malaysia on April 12, 1996. The Malaysian towers are about 30 feet taller than Sears' roof, but that's only because they're topped by 200-foot unoccupied ornamental spires. So if Petronas can count their spires, why can't Sears count the giant TV antennas on its roof? Well, the fact is the practice of counting ornamental spires goes back over 50 years to the rivalry between the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building in New York. And the Council on Tall Buildings has a long-standing precedent of excluding broadcast antennas and flagpoles. To add insult to injury, the Council made its final decision on Sears Tower at a meeting in Chicago. Over the years, many buildings in Chicago have briefly held the title of world's tallest. We'll see several of them as we trace the history of the high-rise on our tour. We'll start out at the tiny Jewelers Building on Wabash, and then visit the Grand Auditorium Building at Michigan and Congress. Next, we'll jump over to Dearborn Street and walk north past some of the world's first skyscrapers. Next, we'll cut over to State Street to see Carson Pirie Scott, and walk north on State past Marshall Fields to the Chicago Theater. Then we'll walk west through Daley Plaza, home of the Picasso, and then on to the State of Illinois building, now called the Thompson Center. Finally, we'll head south into the LaSalle Street Canyon. We'll end our tour at a stately building called the Rookery. What we won't see anywhere on our tour is a building built before 1871, because that was the year that the Great Chicago Fire wiped out virtually the entire downtown area and much of the North Side. Chicago before the fire was a boom town because of its location at the foot of the Great Lakes and the mouth of the Chicago River, on the edge of the broad prairie. It was sort of the gateway to the whole interior of the country, and it was the promised land for fortune seekers. From the 1820s to the 1870s, the population went from a few hundred to 500,000. Most of the downtown buildings were made of wood. So were the sidewalks, even some of the streets. October 8th, 1871 was unseasonably hot. That day's edition of the Chicago Tribune carried this warning: the absence of rain for 3 weeks has left everything in so flammable a condition that a spark might set a fire which would sweep from end to end of the city. Within hours, just such a spark set fire to the O'Leary's barn in a crowded shantytown on the city's southwest side, and that dire prophecy was fulfilled. But Chicago was not about to give up. In fact, the fire seemed to pull the population together in a new spirit of determination. And the rebuilding began immediately. The day after the fire, Schock Bigford and Company began peddling tobacco and fruit and cider from a salvaged mahogany sideboard at State and Harrison. They called themselves the first store in the burnt district. A realtor named W.D. Kerfoot put up a shanty right where his former office had been and went back into business, proclaiming all gone but wife, children, and energy. The ashes were still so hot by the sidewalk that he had to erect his makeshift building in the middle of the street. In less than a week, 5,000 temporary buildings were erected, and 200 permanent ones were underway. The disaster drew a crop of eager young architects to Chicago from the East. The slate had been wiped clean in Chicago. For architects, it was an unprecedented opportunity to create a completely modern city almost from scratch, and it thrilled them. 17-year-old Louis Sullivan felt it the moment he arrived. Sullivan came to Chicago from Boston in 1873 to take a job as a draftsman. He was brilliant and passionate, and hot-tempered and egotistical, too, and he altered the course of American architecture. This is the oldest surviving building in Chicago by Sullivan and his brilliant partner Denkmar Adler, the Jewelers Building from 1882 here on the east side of Wabash, just south of Madison. Thousands of people pass by it every day and never guess its historical importance because, well, the first floor has been completely altered, and the upper floors are basically blocked by the L structure. But even in this modest little building, you can still see hints of Sullivan's future genius. This blockish flower and leaf design is an early version of Sullivan's rich, poetic ornament inspired by forms in nature and his own powerful emotions. Throughout his life, Sullivan crusaded for a truly American style of architecture. He believed the overall design of any building should grow logically and organically out of the building's purpose. He summed up his philosophy in the simple motto, form follows function. 4 years after completing the Jewelers Building, Sullivan was given a chance to try out his theories on a grand scale. He and Adler were hired to design this building at Michigan and Congress. It's the Auditorium Building, and it was one of the most important and anticipated buildings of the 19th century. They were chosen for the job because of Adler's reputation as a master of theater acoustics. Adler had designed a temporary opera hall in 1885 inside a building which stood where the Art Institute is today. It was used for a 2-week opera festival organized by Ferdinand Peck. Now, Peck was a pillar of early Chicago, and he was heir to a vast real estate fortune. He loved opera, and he wanted to prove that it could succeed in Chicago. His festival drew more than 100,000 people and made a handsome profit. Fresh from that success, Peck resolved to build a 5,000-seat permanent opera house for Chicago. But for that, he would need backers. So he devised an ingenious plan to convince investors the building would pay for itself. He would wrap a 400-room hotel and a state-of-the-art office building around the theater, all under one roof. When the pledges started rolling in, Peck turned to Adler and his 30-year-old partner, Louis Sullivan, for the design. When it was finally completed in 1890, it was the largest private building in America. Adler created a special foundation to support the 100,000-ton building on Chicago's sandy lakefront soil. Essentially, he floated parts of the building on gigantic wooden rafts. The slender office tower was the highest point in the city. Sullivan and Adler moved their own offices into the tower to convince people it was safe. They stayed for 20 years. Frank Lloyd Wright was a young apprentice draftsman in that office. Under Sullivan's watchful eye, Wright executed some of the auditorium's elaborate interior ornament. Sullivan and Wright later had a major falling out. The master found out his young apprentice was designing houses on the side and ordered him to stop. Wright walked out, and the two didn't speak for 12 years. The heart and soul of the building is the theater. Here, Sullivan and Adler created a space of dazzling beauty and near-perfect acoustics. Sullivan's highly original ornamental style had matured by this point into these now famous organic leafy forms. This was also the world's first air-conditioned theater. It was rather a labor-intensive process involving 15 tons of ice per day stored in metal chambers under the sidewalks. Workers sprayed water on the ice, and the cool air came out through decorative holes in the theater's ceiling. The auditorium flourished for over 40 years. It was the first home of the Chicago Symphony, and the greatest stars of the day performed here, people like Caruso and Will Rogers, George M. Cohan, and Sarah Bernhardt. But by 1940, the building was bankrupt and converted into a USO facility. The stage, where the world's greatest stars had performed, was used as a bowling alley. But there is a happy ending. Roosevelt University bought the building in 1947 and started restoring it. The theater was restored in 1967 by architect Harry Weiss. Today it's international blockbuster musicals like Phantom, Les Mis, and Showboat. Actually, the original tour of Showboat played the auditorium over 60 years ago. As revolutionary as this building was, it's still an old-fashioned building in one key way. It's a load-bearing building. That is, the exterior walls are more than just decorative. These massive blocks of granite and limestone actually hold up the building. Architects just couldn't build real skyscrapers this way, because as they built taller and taller, they had to make the walls thicker and thicker to support all the weight. The real revolution that made skyscrapers possible happened when architects and engineers learned to support buildings from the inside with metal frames. The frame could be built to dizzying heights, with the walls serving as nothing more than a thin protective skin. The first building to fully use this technology was built in 1885. It was the Home Insurance Building, often called the world's first skyscraper, by William LeBaron Jenney, a Civil War bridge engineer who everybody called the Major. Sadly, like so many of our historic buildings, the Home Insurance Building is gone now. But here on South Dearborn Street near Congress, you can still see some of the world's first skyscrapers. For example, this is the Manhattan Building from 1891, also by William LeBaron Jenney. This was the first 16-story building in the world. This was the kind of building that made everybody stare up in amazement. Maybe that's why Jenney put these funny faces on the bottoms of the bays, so the building stares back. Jenney's somewhat helter-skelter design with its odd mix of materials and shapes, was ridiculed later on by Louis Sullivan, who had actually started out as an apprentice in Jenny's office. Sullivan may have respected his mentor's contributions to skyscraper technology, but he sure didn't think much of him as a designer. Here's what he wrote. The Major was a free and easy, cultured gentleman, but not an architect, except by courtesy of terms. His true profession was that of engineer. Upon further reflection, Sullivan decided Jenny wasn't much of an engineer either. His true calling, according to Sullivan, was hosting parties. But just a block east of here on State Street, Jenny proved he could design with the best of them. His second lighter building of 1891 is an incredibly open and clear expression of glass and interior frame. It seems 50 years ahead of its time. But it was other architects who really perfected the style of these early buildings. Many of them actually started out working for Jenny, like Louis Sullivan, and also John Holabird and Martin Roche. Their style came to be known as the Chicago School of Architecture. And here's a pretty good example, just north of the Manhattan Building on Dearborn. This is the Old Colony Building from 1894 by Holabird and Roche. One of the typical Chicago School features of this building is the division of the exterior into three distinct parts. The base of the building expresses solidity and offers this grand, inviting entrance. Above that, the office floors form a sort of uniform shaft with uninterrupted vertical elements called piers to emphasize the great height of the building. And the top, where the building meets the sky, is decorative and celebratory. Remember Sullivan's famous motto, form follows function. Chicago school buildings also featured enormous windows because heavy load-bearing walls weren't necessary anymore. This was a great advantage in the days before air conditioning and reliable electric lighting. And a special window was created just for the purpose, which came to be known as the Chicago window. It features a huge central pane of glass flanked by two narrow sash windows. These buildings also made use of another innovation, passenger elevators. The earliest ones were actually steam-powered. By the 1890s, hydraulic elevators had replaced them throughout the city, but even those were rather rickety contraptions, causing, on average, one death every 12 days. Across the street, the Fisher Building, completed in 1896, achieves an even glassier, weightless effect with its tall bays and extremely slender vertical piers. But it's encrusted with ornament inspired by the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. Sullivan would cringe. It was designed by Charles Atwood for D.H. Burnham and Company. Daniel Burnham was yet another architect who started out working for Jenny. But unlike his contemporaries, Burnham had no qualms about dressing up his modern buildings in vintage clothes, especially if that's what the client wanted. In this case, the client's name was Lucius G. Fisher, so Burnham flattered him by including these fanciful fish in the trimmings. By the way, the entrance to the Fisher Building is here on Dearborn Street, but the original entrance was around the corner on Van Buren Street, that is, until the L was constructed. Ask most Chicagoans why downtown is called the Loop, and they'll tell you it's because of the L tracks that go around it. But actually, the name originated with the cable cars that circled downtown before the L was even built. The city's first elevated trains were steam-powered, and they stopped just short of downtown because property owners there didn't want the noise and dirt. The man who built the elevated loop was streetcar baron Charles Yerkes. It took bullying, bribery, and deception, but he completed it by 1897. It was one of the wonders of the age, a miracle of ironwork that Chicagoans compared to the Eiffel Tower. Now, we can't move on without answering one of the questions most commonly asked by people visiting this part of the loop. What the heck is that? This massive concrete triangle, which is perforated with window slots, is a jail. It's the Metropolitan Correctional Center at Clark and Van Buren, designed in 1975 by Harry Weiss for prisoners awaiting trial at the federal courthouse across the street. Weiss wanted each cell to have a window. The slot shape was the result of a 5-inch limit imposed by the feds on any opening not covered by bars, but some inmates have managed to break out anyway. The exercise yard is way up on the roof. It's strung with cables to foil any attempted helicopter escape. Back on Dearborn Street, half a block north of the Fisher Building, we find the tallest load-bearing building ever built, the 200-foot, 16-story Monadnock building from 1891. The walls at the base are 6 feet thick to support the tremendous weight of the building. Louis Sullivan called it an amazing cliff of brickwork. After it was finished, the building settled more than 20 inches. The Monadnock was designed by Daniel Burnham's first partner, John Welborn Root. He was a well-educated aristocrat and he was a prolific writer. He designed some of the most ornate and beautiful buildings of the Chicago school. So people were shocked that his daring design for the Monadnock was almost devoid of ornament. What he created was not a simple brick box by any means. It's an elegant and subtle design that curves inward at the base and flares out at the top. Like Sullivan, Root spent his whole life trying to perfect a true American style of architecture. But we'll never know what he could have achieved. He died at age 41 of pneumonia the same year the Monadnock was completed. Burnham was left to find his own direction. By the way, the building is named for Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire. Monadnock is a geological term for a high mountain surrounded by a flat plain. Now, how about this for a striking contrast between stone and steel? Just to the north, directly across the street from Root's building, the ultimate expression of masonry, load-bearing construction, is one of the purest examples of the steel frame, the Federal Center. The Federal Center was designed between 1959 and 1964 by Mies van der Rohe, the father of the modern glass and steel skyscraper. His motto was, "Less is more." Mies believed in distilling architecture to its purest essentials. This became known as the International style. Mies left his native Germany in 1937 to become head of architecture at what is now the Illinois Institute of Technology on Chicago's South Side. He not only redesigned the architecture program at IIT, he redesigned the whole campus. He became one of the most influential architects of the 20th century, even without the flamboyant personality or gift for self-promotion of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. His own Chicago apartment had almost no furniture in it at all. Among his few indulgences were fine cigars and a collection of paintings by Paul Klee. According to author Peter Blake, Mies rarely spoke before 11 in the morning and didn't welcome conversation until after dinner. In fact, his own students at IIT had to petition the school for an annual Christmas party just so they could meet him. The Federal Center is the first of 4 government buildings on our tour. Traditionally, government buildings in this country look like Greek or Roman temples. The great domed Federal Building that once stood on this site was a typical example. With his Federal Center, Mies was the first to really challenge that tradition in Chicago. He created 3 dark buildings. That one over there is sort of a flat slab. It's the post office. Now look over here across Dearborn Street. This one is more of a wide slab, and the third building is sort of a tall slab. He carefully arranged them on this broad open plaza. Mies said, "God is in the details," and spent countless hours working out the exact proportions for all of his buildings. He even dictated the placement of the seams in the concrete plaza. Look how they line up exactly with the columns and window mullions in all 3 buildings. In effect, we're standing on Mies' graph paper. It's been said that Mies abandoned all ornament in his buildings, but that's not true. These I-beams have little structural function, but they create a beautiful shading effect as your eye moves across the building. This sculpture is called Flamingo by Alexander Calder. It was installed in 1974, 3 years after Mies died. It adds color and curvature to this otherwise severe complex. Overlooking the Federal Center Plaza is another famous skyscraper of the Chicago School. The Marquette Building from 1895 by Holabird and Roche. The building is named for Father Marquette, the French missionary who explored this region in 1674. This elaborate bronze relief over the entrance shows some of Marquette's adventures. And wait till you see the lobby. The elevator doors are topped by bronze images of explorers and Native Americans. Some of them are by the same artist who designed the Art Institute lions, Edward Kemys. The mosaics by Tiffany and others show scenes from Marquette's life, including his final hour. The inscription reads like a 19th century melodrama. To die as he had always asked, in a wretched cabin amid the forests, destitute of all human aid. Before we continue north on Dearborn, take a look over here, west on Adams. That's the LaSalle Bank Building, originally the Field Building, a sleek Art Deco style high-rise from 1934 by Graham Anderson Probst and White. This building represents both the beginning and the end of the first chapter in the history of the high-rise. It occupies the site of the first skyscraper, Jenny's Home Insurance Building, and it was the last building completed in Chicago before the Great Depression and World War II brought an end to all high-rise construction in the city. There wasn't another skyscraper built in the Loop until 1957. It's as if we fell asleep watching Fred Astaire on the silver screen and woke up to the Jetsons on television. Chicago went directly from Art Deco to modernism. The gleaming Inland Steel building here at Dearborn and Monroe was designed by the Chicago firm of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. SOM was for many years the largest architecture firm in the country, and the glass box was their specialty. Inland supplied most of the steel for the building, but the company doesn't make stainless steel, so the shiny cladding had to be ordered from a rival firm. Right across the street is First National Bank Plaza. It's very different from the heroic Federal Center Plaza we saw earlier. This is more of a human scale kind of place. It's filled with landscape nooks and crannies. People can relax here, eat lunch, or just watch the world go by. One of the highlights of the plaza is this intricate and fanciful mosaic by Marc Chagall. It's called the Four Seasons, and it was installed in 1974. It invites viewers to linger here and explore. Ironically, Chicago's Four Seasons took a heavy toll on Chagall's Four Seasons. It was recently restored at an estimated cost of $1 million, and it got a new protective roof. The building that stands over the plaza was designed by Perkins and Will with C.F. Murphy in 1969. Here's a great way to look at it. The curving shape is both beautiful and practical. It gives the First National a lot of space at the bottom for public banking functions and smaller floors at the top for tenants who want their desks close to the windows. It's a great illustration of Sullivan's famous motto, form follows function. Sullivan's last major building in Chicago is the next stop on our tour, a block east of here on State Street. It's the Carson Pirie Scott store, which was originally called Schlesinger and Mayer. Sullivan's design was completed in stages between 1899 and 1904. In many ways, this project was the climax of Sullivan's career. Like an oracle or a prophet, he seemed to be giving the world a sneak preview of the 20th century. Never before had he so boldly expressed the steel frame. This gave the store enormous window openings to flood the merchandise with light. Sullivan put the entrance on the corner, a soaring cylinder that welcomes shoppers from all directions. The gleaming white frame of the upper floors is rooted in a lush forest of cast iron ornament that was executed by George Grant Elmsley. He hid Sullivan's initials in the swirling shapes. Even here, form follows function, because the idea was to create a dazzling frame for the merchandise in the display windows. Sullivan thought of himself as a poet. This building was his magnum opus. But before it was even finished, he began to fall on hard times. His partnership with Adler dissolved in 1895. As the years went on, he grew bitter and isolated and struggled with alcoholism. His late designs were works of genius, but they were few and far between. By the end of his life, his marriage had failed. He'd lost his office, auctioned his possessions, and moved into a single room. He died in 1924 and was buried in Graceland Cemetery, where he had designed monumental tombs for Chicago's richest families. But in the end, there was no money for a monument of his own. The large rock that marks his grave was donated by his friends. It bears this inscription: "By his buildings, great in influence and power, his drawings unsurpassed in originality and beauty, his writings rich in poetry and prophecy, his teachings persuasive and eloquent, his philosophy, wherein form follows function, he summed up all truths in art, Sullivan has earned his place as one of the greatest architectural forces in America." Carson Pirie Scott couldn't have picked a better location for its new store. At the turn of the century, State and Madison was called the busiest corner in the world. State Street has been immortalized in song and on film. Until the 50s, it was one of the world's greatest shopping streets. But State Street started declining after World War II, partly because of the growth of suburbia and shopping malls. An ambitious 1980s plan which converted the street into an outdoor mall proved a failure. So in 1996, the city embarked on a new plan, loaded with vintage character, that divides the street into 3 districts. The educational district is anchored by the new Harold Washington Library, the largest municipal library in the world, and a tribute to Chicago's first black mayor, elected in 1983. Washington was an avid reader. He'd pull a paperback out of his pocket whenever he had a short break in his schedule. He had just won a second term when he died in 1987. The design from Thomas Beebe of Hammond, Beebe and Babcock was the winning entry in a competition to design a new library for Chicago. It's sort of a postmodern caricature of a grand classical pavilion. Those rooftop owls symbolize wisdom. They're exaggerated to enormous proportions. The whimsical terracotta ornament includes a puffy-cheeked, windy city man and images of Midwestern grain. Did you know the Chicago Public Library was started with a donation from Queen Victoria of England? She sent 8,000 books to Chicago after hearing everything was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1871. Further north on State Street is the unquestioned anchor of the commercial zone, Marshall Fields, which is located between Washington and Randolph. Marshall Fields was the world's first modern department store. Marshall Field himself came to Chicago in the 1850s when he was just 22 to work as a dry goods clerk. Later, he worked for Potter Palmer, who was one of the city's first merchant princes. Field was a quick study, and eventually he and a coworker bought out the boss and opened their own store. Field's motto was "Give the lady what she wants," and he made a fortune doing just that. He put an end to price haggling and offered quality merchandise, courteous salespeople, and a money-back guarantee. Field also opened the first restaurant in a department store. He got the idea from a clerk in his millinery department. She began bringing chicken pot pies and tea from home to feed her hungry customers because there were no respectable places for unescorted ladies to eat downtown. Today, there are 7 restaurants here at Marshall Field's.
Enjoy your meal, sir.
Thank you. Chicken pot pie is still a featured item here in the Walnut Room. I love this job. In 1992, the store completed a $110 million renovation. They say it's the largest department store renovation in history. Among the treasures restored was this 6,000 square foot Tiffany Dome, which was designed in 1907 and contains 1.6 million pieces of iridescent Favril glass. It took 50 men 2 years to install it. Today's Marshall Field's is actually several buildings built between 1892 and 1907. They were designed by D.H. Burnham and Company. This understated classical design became the prototype for department stores that Burnham's company designed all over the world, including Selfridges in London, Gimbel's in New York, and Filene's in Boston. All of us have met a friend under the great corner clock that was installed in 1897 for just that purpose. The problem is there are 2 clocks on 2 different corners, a fact that's caused a century's worth of missed meetings as well. Diagonally across the street from Marshall Field's, Burnham, the classicist, proved that his firm could design a modern building to rival all others, the Reliance Building from 1894. In the late 1800s, property on State Street was extremely valuable. The developers of the Reliance Building had their eyes on an old masonry building that occupied this site, and they didn't even want to wait for the leases to expire. So in 1890, they jacked up the top 6 floors of that building on temporary pilings so they could tear out the foundation and first floor and start building the base of their new building designed by John Welborn Root. But while they waited for the top floor tenants to move out, the developers ran into another snag. Root died. In 1894, Burnham assigned Charles Atwood to complete the project. As if making up for lost time, the builders erected the top 10 floors of the steel frame in just 15 days. Atwood's design, which was erected on Root's foundation, was the most glassy office building anybody had ever attempted. The tall bays and the creamy glazed terracotta facade made it seem even more light and airy. As State Street declined, the Reliance Building really suffered. It sat there, decaying, covered in soot, and neglected. But then, in 1994, the city put up $6.4 million to restore the exterior. Even the long-lost cornice was recreated. The restoration architect was Gunny Harbaugh of McClear Corporation. It's a paradox that in a city so famous for its architecture, preservation stories like this one are more the exception than the rule. Preservationists have won a few, but they've lost many battles in Chicago. And one of the biggest battle scars is right across the street from the Reliance Building in Marshall Field's. In fact, you might call it an open wound. This was once a block of dilapidated buildings, discount electronics stores, popcorn emporiums, and cheap steakhouses. Little by little, the city bought up the entire block and sold it to developers. They planned to raze all the buildings and build a $500 million office and retail complex designed by Helmut Jahn. But one of the buildings slated for demolition turned out to be the oldest building in the loop. It was the McCarthy Building, designed by Chicago's first architect, John Mills Van Osdol, and preservationists put up a fight to save it. But in the end, the block came down. Unfortunately, the 1980s building boom had peaked, and the developers ran into financing problems. The project was ultimately shelved, and Chicago was left with a very high-profile vacant lot. To its credit, the city has come up with some pretty creative uses for this block. In the summertime, it's home to this outdoor art training program called Gallery 37. And in the winter, it's used as an ice skating rink, drawing the kind of weekend and nighttime crowds planners hope will someday become a fixture on North State Street. That's because this is what the city calls the theater district, including the newly restored Oriental and Palace theaters, the new Goodman Theater, and the Chicago Theater on State Street between Lake and Randolph. This theater launched architects Rapp and Rapp on an illustrious career. In this case, you could pretend you were Louis XIV, surrounded by acres of fake Baroque opulence. They even made the front of the theater look like Paris's triumphal arch. It's partially hidden by this huge marquee, which was installed later and has actually become a landmark in its own right. The city of Chicago helped to fund a $25 million restoration in 1986. As part of the Chicago Theater restoration, the Page Brothers building next door was also restored. It was built in 1872, just a year after the fire, and it was designed by Chicago's first architect, John Mills Van Osdol. Van Osdol was a self-taught architect who came here from New York in 1836 when Chicago was still a wild frontier town. The original front entrance of the building wasn't on State Street. It was around the corner on Lake Street. Long before the L was built, Lake Street was the city's premier shopping strip. The shift to State Street was engineered in typical Chicago fashion by an entrepreneur looking to make a buck. A business tycoon named Potter Palmer quietly began buying up property along State Street in 1868. Then he enticed the Lake Street merchants to move there. His own grand hotel, the Palmer House, also designed by Van Osdol, was finished just 11 days before the fire. The day after the fire, Palmer ordered it rebuilt exactly as before. Van Osdol's Page Brothers building has one of only two surviving cast iron facades in the Loop. Cast iron fronts used to be very common in Chicago, but they all melted in the fire, bringing the buildings down with them, and that made cast iron a very unpopular material afterwards. 2 blocks east of the Page Brothers building is something I've just got to show you. This parking garage on Lake near Wabash is a gigantic touring car by architect Stanley Tigerman. It has a 6-story grille and even a hood ornament. This is as far east as we're going to go on the tour. From here we'll double back and head west to Daley Plaza, named after Chicago's legendary mayor, Richard J. Daley. Daley's famous well-oiled Democratic machine kept him in power for 21 years. He died in 1976 during his 5th term. Daley was a builder on the grandest scale. His legacy includes Chicago's expressway system, O'Hare Airport, McCormick Place, the UIC campus, and more. Sometimes whole neighborhoods and even lakefront parkland were sacrificed in the name of progress. An entire block adjacent to City Hall was leveled to create the Civic Center Plaza, which was later renamed for the mayor. This is the 3rd great public plaza I've shown you on Dearborn Street. Like Federal Plaza, it's a grand civic space. It's also home to the city's most recognized public sculpture, known to everyone simply as the Picasso. Actually, Picasso himself left it untitled. City leaders began courting Picasso in 1963. One delegation brought him a White Sox uniform, a Bears helmet, a fireman's hat, and an Indian war bonnet. Although Picasso never saw Chicago, he agreed to design a sculpture, and he presented the designs to the city as a gift. Now, Picasso's model was only 3.5 feet tall. Fabricating the actual 50-foot, 162-ton work was left up to us. So the city raised $300,000 in donations and hired the American Bridge Division of U.S. Steel in Gary to actually build the sculpture. Precise plans had to be drawn up to take into account the huge wind forces and gravity loads. When it was finished, it was shipped to Chicago in pieces on specially built flatbed trucks and assembled here under wraps. When it was unveiled in 1967, Chicagoans were appalled. but over the years it's become as much of a symbol of the city as the Art Institute Lions or the Water Tower. And we've long ago outgrown our need to know exactly what it is, an aardvark maybe, or an Afghan hound. But if out-of-towners insist on pestering you about it, here's a little trick. Walk behind the sculpture and view it from one side or the other. What you'll see is an over-the-shoulder view of a woman's head. If she looks a little rusty, that's because she's made of Corten steel to match the Daly Center behind her. The material is designed to rust over time. It actually helps to strengthen the steel, and it gives the building its unique color. This is the second government building on our tour, and it breaks the classical tradition again. Mayor Daley wanted this courthouse and city office building to look as modern as the latest skyscrapers. It was designed by C.F. Murphy, along with Lobel, Schlossman, and Bennett, and SOM. It was completed in 1965. One really astonishing feature of the building is the enormous distance between these supporting columns, an unprecedented 87 feet. This engineering triumph required a tremendously powerful steel frame, which the architects have chosen to show off with giant horizontal spandrels and these huge piers of rusting steel. The building has a muscular quality that's all Chicago. The mayor wielded his power from the 5th floor in the city-county building, which is next door here. It's the third great government building on our tour, and it's the only one that's designed in this grand classical tradition. The building was designed in 1911 by Holabird and Roche. They're, of course, best known as pioneers of the skyscraper, but here they created a monumental classical temple instead. These towering columns are 75 feet high. They span 6 stories. By the way, this is the 4th City Hall to stand on this site. Today, the 5th floor office is occupied by Daley's son, Mayor Richard M. Daley, who's leaving his own imprint on the city. Many of his most ambitious projects involve beautifying the city, such as landscaped median strips and lakefront and riverfront improvements, and the redevelopment of State Street. This little abstract sculpture might be gazing enviously at the much more famous Picasso right across the street. It's the playful work of another world-famous 20th century Spanish artist, Juan Miró. It's possible to see it as a woman with a crown floating over her head. I wonder if Miró was making reference to one of Chicago's early nicknames, the Queen City. Already on the tour, you've seen buildings for federal and local government. Now let's walk a half a block north and see the state's contribution to our skyline. This startling design is the result of a collaboration between Chicago's most famous living architect, German-born Helmut Jahn, and longtime Illinois Governor James R. Thompson, who presided over its construction from 1979 to 1985. The building was renamed for Thompson in 1994. As untraditional as the Thompson Center is, Jahn actually used some familiar cliches of government buildings in the design. The curving shape, for example, was inspired by the traditional dome on a neoclassical Capitol building, and the color scheme, which includes baby blue and salmon, is a takeoff on patriotic red, white, and blue. This building has one of the most awesome interior spaces you will ever experience. In a sense, Jahn built another great public plaza for Chicago, and then put a roof 17 stories over the top of it. As curvy and colorful as his work is, Jahn is actually inspired by the austere and disciplined philosophies of Mies van der Rohe, because Jahn attended graduate school at IIT. Jahn's version of glass and steel is much more flamboyant, but no less controversial. This building came in for a lot of criticism when it first opened. It had some well-publicized problems with air conditioning and interior noise levels. People complained about the shape, the color, They even griped about the art, particularly this painted fiberglass work by world-famous 20th century artist Jean Dubuffet. It's called Monument with Standing Beast. But for all the fuss, the Thompson Center has become one of the city's top tourist attractions, right up there with the Picasso. Over on the west side of the Thompson Center is LaSalle Street, the home of Chicago's bustling financial district. Looking south on LaSalle, you can see one of the most dramatic streetscapes in the whole city. Chicago's financial district forms a kind of canyon. Architects here have traditionally created buildings that are very similar in character, size, and material. Even ledges on the buildings are aligned all the way up the street. Architects of the ultra-modern Chemical Plaza here at LaSalle and Madison were so concerned about preserving the canyon effect that they left in place the outer walls from the lower floors of the building that used to be here, Holabird and Roche's Otis building in 1912. The new building, designed by Moriyama and Teshima with Holabird and Root, was completed in 1989. The canyon is really defined by three buildings here at the southern end of the financial district. The Chicago Board of Trade, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and framing it on either side of LaSalle Street, these two great banks with stately classical temple fronts, designed by Graham Anderson Probst & White, a successor firm to D.H. Burnham and Company. They're almost identical. But if you look closely, you'll see that the Federal Reserve Bank here from 1922 features fancy Corinthian columns, while the bank across the street features more modest scroll-shaped Ionic columns. It was built in 1924, and it's now called the Bank of America, Illinois. So, in effect, the local bank defers to the federal bank, but that's only on the outside. The 80,000 square foot Grand Banking Hall here inside the Bank of America, with its 4-story columns, elaborate friezes, and coffered ceiling, is a full-blown Roman temple. Louis Sullivan sneered at this kind of historical borrowing and suggested that the bankers should wear togas and sandals and speak Latin. But I think most of us mere mortals are simply awestruck by the grandeur of a space like this. The banks form a gateway to the Chicago Board of Trade, designed by Holabird and Root and completed in 1930. The architects took full advantage of this jog in LaSalle Street here to give the canyon a towering southern wall. Their dramatic Art Deco-style high-rise seems to reign over the financial district like some sort of serene monarch. It's even shaped like a throne. The building is topped by a 31-foot statue of the Roman goddess of grain. Her name is Ceres, which is where our word cereal comes from. Sculptor John H. Storrs gave her a bag of corn and a sheaf of wheat, but no face. If there's any building that embodies the spirit that built Chicago, it's this one. After all, it was commodities like livestock and grain that helped make Chicago an international city. Carved into the smooth limestone facade are images of a Mesopotamian trader and a Native American exchanging corn and wheat. Below them is one of the building's 3 trading rooms. The Chicago Board of Trade is the oldest and the largest futures exchange in the world. And today, financial futures and options have been added to the traditional agricultural commodities. Every day, an average of 800,000 futures contracts are bought and sold here for hundreds of millions of dollars. But can a city where fortunes are made and lost, trading in futures, learn to find value in its past? Well, there's one other building which we haven't seen yet here at the foot of the canyon that suggests maybe we can, at least when there's good financial sense in it. It stands in the shadow of the Board of Trade. It's the Rookery from 1888, one of the finest works of John Welborn Root and Daniel Burnham. It was painstakingly restored in 1992 by McClear Corporation under Gunny Harbaugh's direction, and it's become one of the most prestigious addresses on LaSalle Street. The name comes from an old water tank in a temporary city hall that once stood on this site. After the fire, the water tank was used as a makeshift library for all those books that Queen Victoria donated. Apparently, the place was a haven for pigeons, so people called it the Rookery. When the new building was constructed, the old name stuck. The architect even hid some birds in the rich ornaments surrounding the entrance arch. This building is by the same architects who designed the austere Monadnock building, which we saw at the beginning of the tour. But here, John Welborn Root let his artistic imagination run free and also experimented with building technology. The proud masonry walls fronting here on LaSalle and Adams Streets are load-bearing with grand polished columns and massive arches and heavy brick piers. But if you look down the alleys, you'll find long ribbons of glass. These reveal that the sides of the building are supported by an interior frame. This was an early experiment in the technology of the future.
And another famous architect contributed to this building. Frank Lloyd Wright was hired to remodel this lobby in 1905.
Wright added smooth white marble with gold inlay. And these urns and light fixtures and other features to this spectacular glass-roofed space. The Restoration architects decided to preserve Wright's lobby, but they did remove one piece of marble to show a fragment of the original lobby designed by Root.
This dramatic 10-story stairway that spirals up through the light court is perhaps the most recognized feature of the building, thanks to this famous photo.
The picture was taken by Richard Nicol. His tragic death helped to inspire a new attitude about preservation in Chicago. His story is told in a biography by Richard Cahan called They All Fall Down. Nicol was a brilliant photographer who began his career in the 1950s. He loved the buildings of Adler and Sullivan, and he was horrified to see many of them torn down in the name of urban renewal. So he started collecting actual fragments of the doomed buildings. Often he would sneak into dangerous demolition sites to collect his treasures. Eventually, he began organizing political campaigns to save the buildings. He picketed outside Sullivan and Adler's Garrick Theater in 1960, but after a year-long fight, it was torn down anyway. Nicol grew more and more sullen and disheartened as he saw building after building fall to the wrecking ball. By 1969, he vowed to give up, but the greatest preservation battle in the city's history was just starting, and he was drawn into it. For 2 years, preservationists fought to save Louis Sullivan's great stock exchange, and when it was apparent that they just couldn't win, the preservationists, including Nicol, spent 3 grueling months dismantling the lavish trading room, which was to be reassembled in a new wing at the Art Institute.
This is the trading room today, inside the Art Institute. As you can see, it's been meticulously and lovingly reconstructed. But Nicol's story doesn't have a happy ending, because even after helping to save this glorious space, he just couldn't stay away from the stock exchange. He was 43. He had plans to give it all up and get married, but against the wishes of his fiancée, he kept sneaking back into the stock exchange, even as the demolition made it more and more unstable every day. Finally, on Friday the 13th of April, 1972, he failed to show up at a dinner at which his fiancée was supposed to meet some of his family. His friends went looking for him later that night at the stock exchange. They found his hard hat under a gaping hole in the partially demolished trading room floor. It took searchers 26 days to find his body, which was buried in the rubble below. Richard Nichols' life and work did make a difference. He and his colleagues were on the fringes back then, part of a grassroots movement. But their message was a simple one, and it caught on. They taught us to stop and look up. And as more and more of us started doing that, a feeling began to spread. A feeling of awe and respect, and above all, a feeling of pride. And word began to spread. Word that Chicago is a living museum of masterpieces by some of the greatest architects of the age.
Today, interest in Chicago architecture is at an all-time high, and it's no longer just architects and scholars who admire Chicago's buildings. They say any cab driver or cop on the street in Chicago these days could show you a landmark or tell you about Louis Sullivan or Mies or Helmut Jahn. Chances are you've given a few tours yourself, to the in-laws maybe, or the out-of-town friends, and undoubtedly they were impressed. After all, this is the birthplace of the skyscraper, the prairie town that built its own mountain range. And that's something to be proud of.